Sinetra tried very hard not to giggle as 7 of her 9 escorts died. It was a very serious matter, death, and she did not want the 2 survivors to get the wrong idea about her. But she told them it was a bad idea from the very beginning. They weren't eldritchy and they really had no business in the beyond. Even she could feel the pressure. Not enough to tear her mind to itty-bitty whittle shreds, but definitely enough to be uncomfortable. Master Dawes couldn't help but press down on things. He was big. Really big. Too big to really understand or explain, though Sinetra had done her very best. They hadn't listened. Not at all. They had just sealed her up and trundled her on back to the very place she didn't want to be. And now they were mostly dead. Not entirely dead, but the 2 still alive weren't doing so well. Blood was leaking out of some very important places. She watched as they wobbled on their feet and she sighed. Maybe they would understand better now, even if Master Dawes wasn't very understandable. Maybe she should escape. Now THT was an interesting thing to think about. They'd taken her powers, but maybe she could get them back after she'd run away. Maybe her mother would. No, better not think that thought. Her mother was already upset enough. If she came back sealed and sobbing, then Sinetra would never hear the end of it. Mother could be so judgy sometimes. Of course, Mother had warned her about going to the Green. That shade witches had no business frolicking about with fairies and Glen humans. That everything in the Green hated things from the beyond and will her lickety-split. That she'd get gobbled up by some griffin or stabbed by a centaur or something even more awful. Awful like getting sealed and forced to be a beyond guide. And now all her little guidees were dead or mostly dead. At this rate, she'd end up sealed or shamed forever. Very unfair. All of it. Her lower lip pouted out. The 2 mostly dead ones had managed to not lose their souls, but were now in the process of losing their minds as they scrambled between the corpses of their fallen comrades. They were very upset about it all, and Sinetra could definitely understand why. One turned to her, wide-eyed and stinking of fear, and pointed a finger. You! Sinetra looked behind her, making sure there wasn't some misunderstanding before turning back. Me? You killed them! He explained, jabbing his finger in her direction again. Sinetra blinked. Me? She repeated again, thoroughly confused. She tilted her head to the side and considered. She had contributed to them being dead, but it seemed pretty unfair to say she had killed them. Certainly they would be alive if they had never met her, but meeting her really hadn't been her fault. She had tried very hard to not meet them at all. But they had gotten very searchy and investigative-y and found her anyways. She was a minor contributor, at best, to their deaths. Maybe she could have double extra warned them to not come, but they hadn't tried to listen to her at all. She told them that Master Dawes would smash their brain to bits. But they'd said they were much too smart and powerful and impressive for that to happen. Wow! Look at him now! So sad. But she wasn't in a gloating mood. Even if things had gone super sideways, this was still her best chance to understand a Glen human. Maybe the pointy ones saw things different. It was up to Sinetra to show she could be more open-minded than they'd been. Set a good example and all. She could engage rather than escalate. A lot could be learned from asking the right questions. Did I? She asked. She could tell pretty quickly that the pointy one did not think that was the right question. In fact, he started extra pointing at her, jabbing his finger in her direction over and over while he squawked. It was very uncomfortable being pointed at like that. Pointing fingers were how a lot of curses and hexes started. She would be quite vexed if she became hexed, especially when she was already all bottled up inside. She was just about to say as much when Strong Leader came up beside Pointy One and put a hand on his pointy finger, pushing it down. Leave it, Reft. This isn't the time or place. We have a job to do. But instead of doing the sensible thing, Reft the Pointy One spun on his heel and began pointing his finger at Strong Leader. Sinetra gasped at the breach. It was one thing to point at an enemy prisoner guide witch, quite another thing to point at a strong leader like Strong Leader. Sinetra hoped Strong Leader wouldn't melt Reft right then and there. If another one of her tour party died, it'd be just the two of them. More like a tour date. Sinetra took a moment to picture the look on her face if she came home with a Glen human of all things. Now that would be worth getting exiled over. Sinetra giggled at that. You see? She's laughing! She killed them and now she's laughing about it, Reft was saying. Sinetra tried to help by explaining she was laughing about something else, but it didn't appear to be very helpful. Glen humans were very confusing. She did nothing, Reft. The realm is hostile, she warned us, Strong Leader said. Sinetra offered a knowing bob of her head to put an underline on the statement. Most of us aren't meant to meet Master Dawes, Sinetra said. Where is he then? If he killed them all, how? Tell me, witch, Reft said. Oh, you must have forgotten. It's okay, I can explain again. She offered him her most welcoming smile. You see, he's everywhere and allwheres. And he killed them by being so much being. Much too much being for a small being to being getting used to being with. She counted up the number of beings just to make sure she'd said that right. If she missed one, it might make things confusing. Reft looked confused. Angry, too. Sinetra let out a sigh. There really was no way to explain things to Glen humans. She looked at Strong Leader for help. I really did try to explain this. It is hard to understand. Still, we have a mission. Can you guide us from here? Very much, yes. Master Dawes is very asleep. The swirls of shade are hardly even swirling. The eddies aren't eddying at all. It's very edifying. She offered Strong Leader her very best curtsy and then turned back to the path leading away from the portal. It was very sad the others had died so quickly. They had hardly even gotten a chance to see her home. The beyond was very beautiful if you lived long enough to see it. All delightful hues of purple, gray, and black painted across a smeared landscape of bottomless stairs and impossible cliffs and blasted infinity. She hopped forward and then crouched down before the winding path leading away from the clearing. She carefully examined each of the stones that made up the path, trying to determine whether they were enemies, allies, or tricksters trying to have a laugh at her expense. To her trained eye, they seemed mostly open to assisting them, though she'd been lied to before. Paths were curious and finicky things, often shifting and moving whenever their stones decided to, regardless of what their travelers wanted. The matter would be much simplified with access to her power. Sinetra frowned, poking a finger on one stone and then another, whispering to each in turn. Things were favorable enough for travel, providing they were respectful and didn't tread on the stones that didn't support them. She looked over her shoulder back at her remaining captor companions. These stones will accept us. She tapped a barefoot toe on the first step of the path. But be careful not to make them angry. Definitely don't touch a purple stone. They aren't friendly at all. They say we're sneaks in the slumber. Sneaks in the slumber? Strong Leader asked. Those who travel when Master Dawes falls to quiet. We are unjudged and therefore unworthy. She giggled and shook her head ruefully. The purple stones are very old-fashioned. Reft was staring pointedly down at his feet now, glancing from one stone to the next. What happens if we step on a purple one? Sinetra's eyes widened. You mustn't. We simply don't have the time to find you again. She took a steadying breath. I know you do not very much like to listen to my warnings. But now that most of you have died, I think it's a good idea to take things a bit more seriously. It is very hard to be a tour guide when the people keep doing the things they're not supposed to do. Do not step on a purple stone, please? Eyelashes batted in Reft's direction. He stared at her, nonplussed. We will avoid purple stones, Strong Leader said. At least there was one sensible person. Sinetra began to hop along the stones, calling out purples when she saw them. Thankfully, there were only a few. She suspected purple stones weren't very popular on this path on account of their generally cantankerous nature. Purple paths mostly went waywards and hinterwards, rather than a big, main, fancy path like this. As they progressed, Sinetra tried to make polite conversation to pass the time. explaining the ins, outs, in-betweens, and inside-outs of the beyond. How most of her kind went to oblivion before they were even born, and how it was very sad. She had lost 5 brothers and sisters while they were still in the tunnel, smote out of existence before they were separated from her mother. She didn't blame Master Do, as he couldn't help but smite things, but she did wish maybe he didn't do it so much. That had been why she'd tried to go to the green, even though Mother had said it was a very bad idea. If she could find a safe spot there, maybe more of her brothers and sisters would live. But then they couldn't come to the beyond without dying. That's what Mother had said. Sinetra thought maybe she could train them, so more would live, but maybe she was wrong. Watching all those powerful wizards and mages that had come with her die so quick had been pretty disheartening. Strong Leader and Reft mostly listened. Every so often they would look at each other after Sinetra said something, but their eyes stayed really focused on the path. "I'm sorry," Strong Leader eventually said, causing Sinetra to startle. She'd almost forgotten they were there. So lost was she in her own thoughts. It took her a moment to replay the conversation and figure out what he was apologizing about. Something about her mother keeping her in a cage for a few years until she developed a curse strong enough to erode it. She gave him a glance. "Did you help her make the cage?" "No. I had nothing to do it, but I'm sorry it happened to you," Strong Leader said. "Sorry I learned how to use a corrosion curse." Sinetra frowned at him now. "It's very useful. I'm sorry your mother did that to you. Locked you up. But how would I have learned the curse then?" Sinetra asked, genuinely curious. Perhaps these Glen humans had discovered something. That would be very nice to know. She had been very bored in the cage. No one should be locked up. Well, that made very little sense. And, frankly, seemed highly hypocritical on account of the present circumstances. "You've locked my powers up." Then she stopped, considering. "Wait, do you work with Mother? Is this a test? Perhaps there was a seal-breaking curse." Her mouth went dry when she considered it. It was so obvious she felt stupid for not having considered it before. But how did you use a curse when you were sealed from using your magic? Strong Leader flushed as Reft looked on in amusement. "No, we do not work for you, Mother." That was a decidedly mother worker thing to say. Sinetra would have to be extra careful. She had learned not to underestimate her mother, though she hadn't considered her mother enthralling a bunch of Glen humans to capture her to teach seal breaking until then. That showed her for being small-minded. It was just that sort of narrow thinking that cost her a pinky on her 8th birthday. Learning lessons was often expensive in the beyond. Well, she could play along. There wasn't any reason to have a bad time just because her captor companion tourists might also be enthralled professors there to help her learn seal breaking. She could walk, talk, and seal break at the same time. She was sure of it. Well, that's good. Not working for my mother. It would make this a lot more awkward. Sinetra gave Strong Leader a squinty eye. Reft snorted and then took a step forward. Sinetra's eyes darted toward him as the foot slowly began to fall down. "Watch out! Purple!" Too late. Reft disappeared,